Hi, everyone, and welcome to The X, a podcast from inside Silicon Valley about how experience shapes everything from products to businesses to entire industries. I'm Brian McLean, and I'm here with Demetrius Madrigal. All right, so today we're going to discuss the recent and ongoing writer strike in Hollywood and beyond, because it has a lot to do with Silicon Valley and how technology has shifted the TV and film industry and how AI is now starting to play a part in it. So, good morning, Dee. How are you?
I'm doing good. I've been following this for a little while now. I think people saw this coming for a bit, and it's unfortunate how streaming has kind of been a part of that. And yeah, I mean, we worked on streaming going back over 10 years ago now, off and on throughout our career. But it's one of those things that now it needs to get figured out.
Yeah. Well, let's be clear about something. As of the recording of this podcast, it has not been resolved, the writer's strike. There is a possibility it could get resolved by the time this thing posts. We think that's kind of unlikely, but if it does, it's still relevant as we're going to talk about how technology kind of plays into the issues that are going on right now. So, just to kind of give everyone some perspective, the Writers Guild of America, which is the combination of the Writers Guild of America East and West are combined together. They've gone on strike, and they've gone on strike because they don't like the way that things are going, especially with their contracts as it relates to streaming, as it relates to artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of other smaller parts in there that we're not going to get into today. The TV and Film Writers Union, the Writers Guild of America, started back in 1954, and it's a joint effort of those two unions, the East and the West, coming together to try to represent anyone who writes in film, television, radio, and online media. As I said, they are striking for a variety of reasons, mostly because of streaming and how it's kind of changed the business dramatically. It's really reduced a lot of the royalties for writers and made it much more difficult for them to make a living off of what they do and what they do that we all love in television. So let's kind of dig into it a little bit today. So, what are your thoughts on what's going on, Dee?
Well, I think part of this is because, the biggest thing is ultimately, I think, because streaming kind of changes the whole formula for residuals.
Uh huh.
Before streaming, shows when and movies after they were out of the theater, we get shown on TV. You'd have a certain amount of revenue that was associated with that from advertising, and then that can get turned around into residual checks that went to the writers, the actors, anybody else who's involved in the development and production of that show or movie. As things moved to streaming, it was now a new model. It wasn't like an individual subscription model, so you could or a advertising model, so you can see the revenue associated with a particular showing of something, and it was more of a subscription model. And to compound that, so now you have one subscription that was one fee that was being distributed across that was covering the cost of all the different shows that were on basically the entire library. A lot of these companies, and we know because we work with them, they take data privacy very seriously. They don't want to know people knowing, except what they're willing to release, how many streams each individual show was getting, because they consider that viewership data as well as like how long they viewed, what parts they viewed, where they stopped, where they rewinded, those to be their property that gives them a competitive advantage. So if you're looking at Netflix versus HBO Max, for example, or Disney Plus, then the data that Netflix has as far as who's watching which shows, when, where, how, why, is it has value that it gives them a competitive advantage in picking which shows to produce and which shows to market and so on and so forth. And if that becomes public, then they could view that as losing their advantage.
I see. That really shakes things up from a contractual standpoint because when you think about traditional television, and Vox did a nice piece on the writer's strike where they talked about it, is that, back in the day when you would write for a show, you might write for that show for, let's say, 12 weeks, but when the show is complete, you get a residual on it. And because those shows were pretty persistent, let's say you worked on Friends or something like that, that the difference between what you made during the time in which the show was being produced versus residual can be massive. And that could be the difference for a lot
Yeah.
of people when it comes to whether or not they can buy a house or do other big things with their lives. And it almost looks now like it's more like, okay, like contract work. Like you come in, we'll pay you, let's say, I don't know, $10,000 an episode, and you work on 12 episodes, and then you may not have another job for 2 more years after that, but you can't survive on that. It's not enough.
Yeah, there's kind of a like along with this. I think the main crux of things is the way that the residuals model has just kind of been broken by streaming, and
Yeah.
part of that is just because when they last went on strike and negotiated this contract, streaming wasn't used this way. I think it was 2007 was the last strike. Streaming back then was just like, all right, well, we'll put some short videos on YouTube and stuff, and the capability didn't exist. Well, it kind of existed, but it wasn't really there where you'd put like a whole season of TV on a streaming service. So the studios made the argument that this doesn't happen, so let's not cover it right now. It's just going to be promotional, and it hasn't been changed since then. And they've kind of been they've kind of been profiting in the gap of like they probably recognize that this needs to get changed at some point, but they're going to take advantage of it while they have a favorable agreement. Um, Along with that, as you mentioned, the writers are not like employees in the traditional sense. They usually get hired on for a project, and that project can last 4 weeks to 6 months or however long it is. But at some point, that show or production will end either because the season ended or it was always just planned to be like a movie and it's done, and then they need to go off and get their other job. So kind of in tech, it's like an agency model, right? You would go and you get a contract, you work that contract ends, and then you need to go out and get other contracts. Writers can't really do what we do in agencies, where you kind of have overlapping contracts as much because it's really hard to write on two things simultaneously. So the other thing was they went from back in the old days when things were network shows, you had like 22, 24 episode seasons, and you would get started and write the first few episodes, and then the season would start, and you would continue working throughout the season. So they'd continue writing. The way it's done now with kind of the streaming shows like Stranger Things and things like that is they write the entire show ahead of time, and then that gets produced. And they
Mm-hmm.
don't usually keep writers around other than the showrunner, who's basically the head writer, and that is the person who's then becomes entirely responsible for everything else. So, where before getting hired to work on a show meant that you were employed for most of the year, now it usually means you're employed for a couple months. So, there's more of a gap to cover. And historically, that gap between production, like, in the old days, you'd have the season would end in May or June, and then it'd pick up again in September to cover that period. It's one of the reasons residuals exist, because they're giving up their copyright in exchange for residuals. It's not technically royalties, because royalties are in exchange for a license to the use of the IP that you own.
Mm-hmm.
And this, they're doing it as work for hire, so in exchange they're getting residuals. So it's it's one of those things where it's obvious that the studios, including tech companies like Netflix, need to resolve this, but the way in which it gets resolved is really unclear.
Well, I mean, the way it gets resolved is they need to be paid more, essentially. They need to have a
Mhm.
structure that basically allows them to feel confident in the work that they do because they're so valuable. And the most we've talked to a lot of people who work in the film industry, and the most valuable thing you can do is have a writer who's really tight on the film, let's say, and working with the actors, right? So it's like, oh,
Mhm.
this line isn't delivering right. Okay, let's rewrite that line. Let's talk about it. Why isn't it delivering right? Like it's a relationship, just like in tech. We have the relationship between user experience and engineering and marketing, and everybody works really close, and they support one another and try to like figure out the best plan forward. I think if you take the creative side of being a screenwriter and you kind of cannibalize it, you don't make them feel appreciated and part of the process. I just think it leads to more challenging situations related to creativity and being able
Mhm.
to produce amazing shows, right? And so uh, I I don't fully understand the business model of being a writer, in the sense that, like, when you go into it, are you kind of just under the assumption that, like, you'll have a couple gigs a year, or is there a way to ensure that you can move from gig to gig? And I think it's quite nebulous in whether or not you're going to have work or not have work, and I think that
Mhm.
anxiety is kind of what they're trying to work out.
Yeah, I think it's a big part of it because in the old days, if you're a writer on SVU or Friends, like the what we showed before, you're pretty much set. You got this
Oh
hit
yeah.
show, you're getting residuals because it's being shown to this day on TBS or TNT or whatever else, 5 times a day. So you're getting residuals on each of those, and they are more comfortable providing residuals on that because they can directly, from an accounting perspective,
Mhm.
say, "All right, this is how much we got paid from TNT, USA, whoever's showing it." In order to do that, they know how much they're bringing in because they're selling the advertising. So it's easy for them to do an accounting work to say, "All right, this is our money in, this is our residuals out, we're all set."
Yeah. I think whenever it's challenging to figure out the accounting, it always becomes
Mhm.
a problem. There always ends
Yes.
up being a rub, right? We've seen that as
Yes.
as well. Like, even when we were working out royalty agreements, we were just like, look, flat fee, X number of years, percentage
Mhm.
based on this, cut and dry, make it easy for the accounting department, right? Like, we didn't want to have something where it scales constantly and that kind of stuff, because we knew that we were going to have to try to track all that stuff. And it also makes it hard. And when it makes it hard on them, it makes them want to walk away from it.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why, just to provide the perspective, it's the streamers and studios are, other than just they want to keep the money, obviously. Their reluctance to commit to something is because, unlike the old days where you had the revenue directly associated with the showing of that piece of content, now it's a subscription model, so it's somehow distributed in some way that probably isn't fully figured out. So it's not entirely clear to the companies how much each individual stream is worth. So what they will probably end up doing is something similar to, or what I imagine this could look like, something similar to what they're doing on Spotify or some of these other services, where, like, oh, you get paid a per stream amount.
Hmm.
That's a challenge though, because the streamers like Netflix, Disney Plus, HBO Max, Apple Plus, Apple TV. I was
Apple
just
TV.
confused between. They are figuring out what that is. Like, is a stream of a second season episode of The Simpsons worth as much as a stream of a new episode of Ted Lasso? Right? Even if
Yeah.
you can say, like, one of them is probably driving subscriptions and one of them isn't. So there's an element of how to figure that out. They are also closely guarding the streaming numbers for them for each of these shows. So if they start basing it on per stream amount, like they do with the other platforms, that means that they have to share that information at least with whoever is receiving those residuals. And you can have all the NDAs in the world, but at some point that information is going to get out, and they don't
Hmm.
want that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next big kind of area to explore is kind of AI, which I was actually, to be honest, I was actually, when I heard about what was going on, I was kind of surprised that it came up so often. And then I started realizing that, well, ChatGPT basically just provided a case study for what's possible down the line, especially as ChatGPT 4 becomes 5 and 6 and things like that. And I understand that, like, if you don't put provisions in to kind of protect you for technology as it comes down the pipeline, you could end up in trouble 2 years from now, 3 years from now. And so
Yeah.
basically, what this is all about is the idea that, what if the studios decide, you know what, here's what we're going to do. We're not going to hire writers anymore for these shows. We are going to have people internally use ChatGPT, those types of services, and produce scripts for shows. Then we're going to hire one or two writers to work part time and to
Mhm.
modify those scripts and enhance those scripts and make them more interesting or exciting, and cut out a big percentage of the writers that we would normally have on staff. And that is a concern for theirs. Like, could they lose their jobs because ChatGPT or other similar services have enough creativity. Maybe it's not the best, but it's enough in order to keep users entertained. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult one to solve. I think I've been on record that I don't think that we're anywhere close to the point where AI can just full on replace writers. But I think it can supplement the work of writers to the point where we're getting pretty close to the scenario that you're talking about, where instead of hiring, six writers or eight writers in order to write a season of an 8 episode show,
Uh,
you're now hiring half that and filling in the rest with AI because those writers can just go and go to ChatGPT or other platforms and get enough in so that they can just do kind of edits and reworking and fixing the problems that the AI failed to resolve, and that goes out. Another issue with that is the people who are going to do that are going to be more senior people. They're not going to
yeah,
be younger writers and people
exactly.
who know what works and what doesn't work on screen. So how do you get to be that point if now? How do you get to be a senior writer if there are no more junior writer jobs because it's all being taken by AI?
Yeah, so
So
this has happened in lots of industries. I mean,
yes,
I was talking to a couple of people that worked in marketing recently, and they said we don't even have marketing interns anymore. Like
yeah.
they barely ever see it. The recs go out for like I need let's say mid level. I need a manager level, right? And then it's like from there you can work your way up to VP or something like that over time. But like what happened to the junior associates and the people coming right out of school that can help out with a lot of things and learn as they go and stuff like that? A lot of that stuff has disappeared. You know,
And the career track is an issue and is a concern. I think it's something that everybody needs to think about. Of like, all right, well, if AI is going to be doing a lot of this, taking the role of a lot of the junior employees, how do we get senior employees after that?
yeah, no, it's a real thing. I mean, they recently resolved the direct potential directors strike, and I realized, like, for a director, I mean, you're not going to have AI direct your film, you know what I mean, or your show. It's like that's a completely
You
different.
very well could
I mean, you
is the thing.
theoretically could, but that's a lot more complicated than saying, "Oh, pop out a script and have someone just edit it," right? And I think that is a real concern. It should be a concern of theirs, right? Like I could see this happening in 2 to 3 years. It'd be good enough. Good enough. I'm not saying great because I think a lot of the great shows come from emotional experiences and pain and different things that have happened in people's lives and all that kind of good stuff. Not to say that AI couldn't like replicate it, but if it can replicate it good enough, then you can get shows out there and have success with those shows across a number of shows rather than investing into one great show that's going to cost you a tremendous amount of money, right? So there's definitely a shift in the industry. This feels like an inflection point in the industry. This is feels bigger than just what it sounds like on paper.
Well, the thing is, I don't know. I mean, we've talked about before. I think it's that you shouldn't be able to copyright something that was written by an AI. It copyrights you for people,
Yeah.
for humans who produce something. But the way around that is, you get it, and then you have a writer do a rewrite, and that rewrite is owned by that person. So, as far as the limitations for AI to provide kind of that junior role,
Uh huh.
being that person that can kind of generate like the starting points and or bouncing ideas around with an AI. I don't know how that can get limited, but maybe there's, instead of looking at it from a process standpoint, there's something that can be done on the other side where there's a guarantee that a certain number of people are employed for any given project of a certain scope. I'm not sure. But the way this absolutely needs to get figured out, it could over time affect writers, editors, directors, composers, almost any creative. Eventually, could be heavily impacted by this approach. Actors, you can have AI actors for sure, and this is something that, from a creative standpoint, this should be preserved so that even if somebody's out there making an AI film,
Uh huh.
and it's interesting that there are, and that could be like film festival stuff and things like that. Maybe it's something that just goes out on YouTube and everybody thinks this is awesome. But like the human element of art production in general should be preserved and made sure that this is something that's going to go forward, because eventually a lot of the productive stuff is going to be, a lot of utilitarian work is going to get replaced by AI.
Yeah.
So, and ideally, that would lead to more people being able to pursue the arts. But if the arts are now completely kind of also controlled or happen mostly through AI, then we end up in a really sticky spot.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be like AI versus non AI. It'll say something like, this show is produced by real writers. Like, it'll be like a perk. Like, we
Yeah.
had actual real writers rather than AI. But, this is one of those things. Remember what Walt Disney said? You should always have one foot in the past and one foot in the future. It's
I don't know if
probably,
he said that. I think somebody said that of him, but yeah, he was actually really successful because he did that. He would make movies like, uh, you know, uh, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea alongside Sleeping Beauty. So that I think is a big factor in his success.
yeah. But I mean, I think about that and I go, okay, this is maybe slightly less about saying like we don't want AI or we don't want to be involved in AI or anything like that, and more about figuring out how do you even work with it, right? And
Yes.
how do you become an amazing writer, um, and follow your passion of writing for film, or do you look at it and say, look, that's just not a career opportunity anymore. Like, I'm coming out of school right now, it looks like it's going to get cannibalized at some point. What is it called now? Maybe it's like a a writer's assistant or something like that, and you work with technology in order to do it. I mean, you look at, we used to hire like banks of people that would just type all day long, type, 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 print stuff out for you, and then you would, at work, and you would deliver it to people and stuff. And that all kind of went away, and then people started typing their own stuff, and then they hired assistants again, and they ended up typing and managing things, and then working with you more as a partner. That's why they're called executive assistants now, because they are your partner helping you achieve a goal. So it might form itself in that way. In the meantime, though, we need to take care of the people, that are doing these jobs right
Hmm.
now, and find a transition that makes sense for them, for sure.
Yes. I think the most immediate thing is really about these residuals, because otherwise AI is important, and it's I don't think it's going to be completely solved with this contract, with this strike, but I think it can help to establish something for the AI. But the residuals kind of need to get solved now, or this profession can't sustain itself.
Absolutely.
The big challenge there is that a lot of these streamers don't even have the infrastructure in place in order to figure out what these residuals should be, and as a result, they don't necessarily want to commit to something in a formal legal contract that they're going to turn around. You look at Twitch and Spotify and all these people that are paying per stream; they're constantly changing the amount back and forth.
Yeah.
Like, they're
Yeah.
making little adjustments because they're finding that, like, okay, that wasn't quite right. We're turning a loss because of this or that or whatever. If the studios formalize this in a contract without knowing what the appropriate number is, then that could be detrimental to them, and they don't want to get in that spot. So this is a difficult one, but at the same time, the Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, they're getting ready to strike. Also, they had a strike authorization vote. I want to say last week or the week before. It's entirely possible that you could see actors also strike,
Mhm.
concurrent with these directors strike or this writer strike, and then everything will get shut down from a production standpoint, and the studios are going to have to make a significant decision at that point.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm sure they're working through it day and night right now, trying to figure out what to do about it. I mean, the industry has functioned the way it has for a very long time and produced
Yeah.
some amazing stuff that's out there. But let's talk about what like a resolution would look like for this. So, based on what you've seen and kind of what's going on, how do you think this is going to get resolved?
Well, I think the residual agreement. I anticipate that it's most likely going to be something like a per stream amount, like the Spotify amount. Now, because I don't think that the streamers are confident in what that amount could be, considering that to pay, you know, a lot of times actors, directors, writers down the line, there might be some flexibility built into that where they can now reassess and apply for something in the as far as adjusting the rate at some point. They might also try to go for some other simplified version because they don't necessarily want to get into like investing in entire new departments of accounting just to handle the residuals. So
Yeah.
there might be some kind of in between thing where they all pay a certain amount just to host it on the platform, and then maybe there'll be tiers. Like if you stream within this range and that range, you get this amount. If you stream within this range and that range, you get this other amount, and that could help simplify things for them.
Do you think you'd ever go down the path of just hiring them as full time employees, or let's say an employee for a period of time? So you say like, okay, we have this show and then a potential show coming after that. We're going to employ you for a year. You get benefits. You get this. You get a full salary. You get, let's say, a little percentage of back end after you leave, but like you're just on salary for a year, and then you just understand that like your contract is up after that. Instead of being being on contract for 12 weeks, you could just put them in the whole year, and then they're supporting basically the different shows throughout the year. I don't know.
I think it's a half measure. There's still the the fact that they have the the legal right to the IP that they created. So you can pay them for the amount of work that they're doing,
Uh-huh.
right? The hours that they're putting in. You can consider that, you get into work for hire and things like that. But I think writers look at, especially because they're writing, it's not always something that's written for what we consider strictly for hire. It's sometimes they're writing things on spec, speculation, and then they sell it. In which case, they have to sign the rights to the IP, and in return, they need to get some kind of residuals. So it can be a bit of a band-aid. It can be part of the problem, and I don't think they would want to do that because the production schedules they ramp up, that they ramp down. They don't necessarily want to pay someone to kind of sit around
Hmm.
in between production, and they also will sometimes need to bring more people in, or
Yeah.
because something's going on. So I don't know. I think there's a reason why this model kind of fit for film and TV industry, and I don't know that they're necessarily going to get away from that completely.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a complicated one. Also too, like in some cases the writers are bringing the scripts or bringing the content, right? And then in other
Mm-hmm.
cases they're being asked to join a writer's room, and there's
Mm-hmm.
a whole series of writers that are there. So those are all different situations, right? And like you said, in some cases they own the IP, in some cases they're coming in just to help, right?
Yeah, and to be clear, we are fairly familiar with what's going on from the streamer perspective
Uh-huh.
and the technology that's involved and the viewership and all those and how they're using the data, because that's what we have personal experience with. From the writer side of things, it's mostly from talking to people or listening to what other writers are saying out there in the world. But this is something where, unless you want to continually I mean, if you get to the point where it's writers are kind of reduced role, you're probably just going to see the same show made over and over again with like slightly shuffled around details and a different name on it.
Hmm.
And that's kind of what would happen if there were not human writers to introduce new ideas and have new concepts. It would just be, another season of, or another show that copies Seinfeld
Yeah.
with different characters and set in Austin instead of New York City.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Okay. So if you told the AI, you created a sandbox and you put in every episode of Seinfeld, including the
Mm-hmm.
concept, right? And the treatment. And then you said, this show is incredibly popular from this period to this period. Please update this based on our current year, 2023, let's say 2024, write something new, have new characters, whatever it is. And it popped out something that was quite interesting and people loved it and people watched it and it was great. Maybe it wasn't great as the original Seinfeld, but it was something else. Um, do you believe that that is, I don't know, like a valid way of approaching content? And number two is, are there IP issues with that because of the fact that we just asked a system to take something that someone else wrote and basically rewrite it and change it enough that we can produce a new show out of it?
Well, I mean, there's always taking inspiration. I think that's pretty much always existed, and you can look back and Seinfeld was probably based on something else previously. It's definitely true of music and philosophy. They say that there's been no unique thought for centuries at this point. Um, but it's I think there's a functional issue with that, and I think if you went back to the late 1990s and said, okay, well we have this AI who can write the show for us. Here are our most popular shows. Let's go do that. I think if that happened at that point in time, you never get Breaking Bad, you never get Game of Thrones,
Uh
you
huh.
never get Stranger Things. Maybe Stranger Things because there were things in the 80s like Goonies that was popular, but a lot of these shows that came from human imagination and kind of inspiration, they probably don't exist. You just get more kind of copies, and that's it. And copies exist now, obviously, and they will continue to, and they always will. And inspiration will always be a factor. But if you don't have humans, because AI is not really generative of new ideas that way, and it probably won't be for a long, long time, you just get rehashes over and over again. I don't think we want to restrict ourselves to that.
Yeah. I look at this, just take a step back and I think about it and I empathize with them because I feel like this is one of those things where technology is kind of eating the world. And
Yeah,
this is one of those situations where we've seen it happen in other industries. And it seems very apparent that this is going to happen. Like there is no kind of way around stopping the technology and going back to the original model unless one of the studios says like, oh, we don't want AI, we only want to work with the traditional model of having writers come in and paying them and that kind of stuff. And so the resolution here is going to have to include, how do we work with AI, how do we embrace it and use it as part of our process but not get replaced in the sense that we all lose our jobs out of it, but something new
yeah,
comes from it, right? It's actually a hard time to be doing the strike too, because I think the studios saw the writing on the wall with ChatGPT and they're like, hey, look, we could save a ton of money in the future with this. And so they're going to probably want to write in their contract something that gives them some form of flexibility.
yeah. And I think the AI is a big flashy thing to pay attention to now. But again, I think that the at the end of the day, it's the residuals are probably the most important thing because that's what can put in your food on your table now for the next probably 10 years before until we get to the point where AI could potentially take over. So I think that's one of the ways it's grounded, and I think that as people who've worked over the last 10 plus years, 15 years, however long it's been, we worked in streaming, we've worked on AI. You know, this isn't necessarily part of the outcome that we intended. I think we intended to be able to distribute content in a more effective way to make it easier for people to watch the shows that they want to watch. And I think that a lot of the new forms of TV where it's more like a through line of narrative that each episode picks up and continues, as opposed to the old 80s and 90s episodic stuff, is possible because of streaming, and that
Mm-hmm.
you could watch a show outside of the premiere rather than back in the 90s. If you missed that episode, there was just no way to watch it until the summer. uh, but every time you work on something from a technology standpoint, there are some growing pains that are going to need to get figured out, and that's kind of where we are now, where I think streaming has done a lot for people and AI will do that, but there's
Mm-hmm.
also going to be some downsides that we need to deal with and try to figure out.
Yeah, and we'll stay on top of the story and we'll follow it and we'll do a follow up on it. But we wanted to do a short podcast on it because it's so important and it really is kind of the talk of the town right now in Silicon Valley because streaming and the way in which it was created was built from engineers here in the valley. I mean, it kind of came from Netflix, right? And we kind of saw all this stuff unfold, you and I, like a decade ago, and those issues were not hammered out back then, right? They were hammered out when it became a problem, or getting hammered out,
Mhm.
sorry, when it's becoming a problem. And so is it one of the lessons I think from this is also trying to think through a lot of these scenarios like they're doing with AI right now before they actually become real big issues.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, I think this is a wrap for our shorter episode. I'm actually curious too from our listeners if they enjoy us doing a little bit shorter episodes where we kind of get right to the point and just kind of talk about what's happening in the news on a certain topic, but maybe not going into as much depth. If you do have thoughts on it, we'd love for you to send us a message on at the X Podcast on YouTube. And as we always say, please tell a friend, share, let everybody know about this podcast. We do it because we love it, not because we're getting paid, just because we're having a good time. So thank you all for listening, and we really appreciate it. And we will see you all next week.